Welcome everyone to Breaking into Tech. I'm really excited to do this episode. I've been doing a lot of research to get ready for this episode. We are not interviewing a Sabio graduate. Instead, we're going to interview Ramona from WealthBuild, learn a little bit about what they're doing and some of the other stuff going on in the tech industry. So I really think this is going to be a great episode. If people have questions, feel free to put them in the comments and I'll get to them as we go through it. But thank you so much for being on the show, Ramona. I'm so glad you're here.
Yes, thank you. I'm a huge supporter of Sabio and all of the programs. We've worked with Sabio for a very long time. And in fact, my co-founder on WealthBuild, both of my co-founders with WealthBuild are Sabio grads. So huge supporter. And I think this is a great opportunity to share what Sabio grads can get into.
Yeah, I mean, it was so fun to do all the research and to learn about what WealthBuild is doing and just, the tech world. So can you give us a little bit of background about who you are before we start diving into WealthBuild and some of the other topics we have lined up? Can you tell us like how you got into tech and what you're doing today?
Sure. So I have a very non-linear pathway to tech. I mean, I have a very varied background in terms of my career. I actually started my career in journalism, worked for 60 Minutes. That's what took me to New York from UCLA. I was an undergrad, English major for as an undergrad at UCLA. Went to New York about 25 years ago, worked in public policy, did international human rights work for many years, traveled the world. That was amazing work, and then ended up going to law school and focusing primarily on financial law. So worked in bankruptcy at in the Southern District, went to the SEC and worked in asset management, and then did litigation, private securities litigation. And that was great work. It was really fun. I worked on Madoff and MF Global, so a lot of big cases, kind of got my hands in the mix of finance, and have always been very technically curious, meaning I've been pretty good at it. Like I can kind of learn things fairly quickly, and I like technology. And so, in sort of starting my first company, I actually got connected to Sabio and was part of their training program to build the first version of our platform. And that was back in 2016, I think. And so kind of learned while I was building. And I think that because of my background as a researcher, as in analytics, as a lawyer, that I think falling into tech as a founder is actually a pretty natural progression, and I use all of the skills that I bring every day in terms of sort of the different backgrounds that I've kind of come out of. So yeah.
Yeah, I've noticed that with graduates who have like gone through the program that their background is really diverse. And then my own background, my degrees in civil engineering and now I host a podcast and freelance, right? And it's not like a traditional path, but I use so many of the things from both my time in the military as a civil engineer and as, an entrepreneur, and I use all that stuff together and it helps me grow and it just works for me. But on paper, sometimes people are like, this doesn't make sense. And I'm like, there's a story to it. It does make sense. But
Absolutely. And I think it's a really important, actually, as an engineer, a software developer, when you're building products, to come from a lot of different backgrounds. It really helps because at the end of the day, remember, there's always a customer using your product, right? And so I think, one of the programs that we love to work with Sabio is the VETS program, whether that's the GI Bill or other programs. But Danny is one of my co-founders. He's also a vet out of St. Louis. And so I think even that skill of leadership, working in teams, understanding, long-term projects and planning, those are great skills to bring to a startup.
for sure, yeah. Yeah, Danny and I had a great conversation. He was on the podcast a few months ago, and yeah, went back to look at it, and I was like, "Well, we talked for a long time." There was just so much synergy and so much
Right.
that he had to share, and it's so exciting to learn a bit about the company that he mentioned, like in the background that he was working on, and so that's really exciting. So, one of the topics that we've talked about on this podcast is AI, because there's a lot of people talking about AI, there's a lot of people afraid of AI, there's a lot of people excited. There's like all the emotions. So before we dive into Wealth Build, let's talk a little bit about AI and what you've seen as a founder in the tech world.
Absolutely. So AI, yes, I agree. There's so much confusion around AI in some ways. And I think because it's a layered technology. So if I want to like pull back for a second, large language models, which is essentially like big data combined with deep algorithms and analytics, has been around forever. Well, at least from our time, right? Over the last sort of 20, 30 years, these have been progressing and getting better. Much of the technology that we use already before quote unquote AI was using large language models, was using algorithms, was using big data. So this is not a new wave. I think what's happened is that it's advanced to a point where it's now accessible to one, developers, and then two, to the consumer, direct to consumer. So what has been sitting in the background is now in the forefront. And because of that, it's actually just the technology moving rapidly for use cases. And so large language models, the algorithms behind sort of how to use those large language models have been in play in everything, from core technology to fintech applications. So given that that's been there, I think what we've seen now is that people are starting to build applications on top of that. So very few companies right now are building LLMs. Those are what we call foundational models. That's the big data that essentially fuels the conversations you're having on ChatGPT or on Bing, etc. So if you think about those as separate, that's that sort of the large data set that it's using to have the conversation with the end user, or for manipulating the data. And then on top of that, you have sort of the what I call the tooling, right? The AI tooling, which allows us to work with AI, right? As a developer, and usually those are going to come in the form of APIs. But think about like Hugging Face and Pinecone and these other tools that allow you to vectorize or to search. Those are Raza, even, that allows you to build inside of the AI. Those are the tooling companies, right? And so those are getting really big, and they've gotten lots of funding, and they're really important, for us to be building on top of. And then we come in almost at that like third layer, and I think that's where a lot of the activity is right now. um, I mean, how many now apps are there for like copywriting, right? It's already integrated into everything. And that was quick, right? Jasper kind of kicked it off, and now you see it inside of your emails. There's so many now, copywriting, or let me write your text or rewrite your text. So that was sort of on top of all these language models. And that's what we're building. So we use foundational models, we use the tooling, and then what we've done is created a use case for essentially wealth management, or personal finance. And I think that's what you're going to see across the board. There are still some companies that are working obviously on the large language models. I think Cohere is another one of those companies. But I think that's where you start to understand the stack itself, right? And where you want to play. So that's one piece. And then I think in terms of the, where people get really scared about, sort of, oh, AI is going to take your jobs. So with every, job, there's going to be two other jobs that are going to be created that are related to the AI technology, because at the end of the day, it's still data, and it still requires interpretation. It still requires somebody to build on top of it, right? So just having access isn't enough. We're going to still need really deep brain power, human brain power, to do some of these things. And I think at the end of the day, people still want human interaction in a lot of the use cases. So we're going to see a ton of progression in workflow. And so, yes, if you are in a repetitive workflow vertical of employment, you might want to start thinking about upskilling. I don't think, but I
Yeah.
wouldn't be afraid of it, right? I mean, I think it actually will help to get you a higher paying job, a more diverse job. There's going to be different types of opportunities that are going to be available, and this is going to be key for a lot of policy people to make sure that we're doing that upskilling. I think where people get really scared though is some of the generative AI that's image related. So I'm somehow my image got replicated with AI and some company is using it. So everyone's freaked out. They're like, "Oh my God, someone's using your image." And I think that, look, this is just going to be part of the new wave. Yes, someone is using my image. Yes, AI can create a talking image that looks very much like me. I've been playing around with HeyGen, and it literally in 2 minutes can create an avatar that looks like you and talks like you. Um, is that scary? Yes. And we are going to have to come into this new decade with protocols and understanding of AI so that we understand what it can do and what we should be looking out for. But this is also like any new major shift in technology rails, like HTTP, like crypto. Those were major shifts in technology. You're going to have to sort of be aware of and more educated about that technology to understand where the risks lie. Cybersecurity issues obviously huge in AI, but those have been around. Those were already there. They're just sort of
Right.
being escalated, right? So anyway, I'll stop there because I think that's sort of the way that I think about how to approach it.
Yeah, so many of the things that you talked about, I was like, "Oh, yeah, large like, you don't think about it because you just start hearing this word AI, and you don't think about, like, where did it come from? It kind of felt like it, like, just sprouted out of nowhere, but it really just built on technology we were already using, and they're just using it a new
That's right.
way and adding to it, and so, yeah, that was a great way to explain it. I really loved that, and so I'm like, "Oh, mind blown." So let's shift to focus and now talk a little bit about like what Wealth Build is and what you guys are doing
Sure.
and how it started.
Yeah. So I think just sort of the vision, my personal passion and my personal vision in using technology and becoming a tech entrepreneur was there's a problem I want to solve. It's best solved using technology. I mean, like that's the core, right? Which is I want people to be able to have the knowledge and tools and access to make smarter financial decisions so that they can build wealth for their families and their communities. That's, I mean, that it's as simple as that, right? And the way that's traditionally that's been happening is that, you have a relationship with your bank, you have a relationship with your wealth manager. But again, a lot of those, what I call sort of more traditional wealth management um, services are often inaccessible because they're expensive. They're out of touch, unfortunately, right? The things have just shifted so much. And I think a lot of it doesn't make sense. People don't have the time, they don't have the resources. And so, how do we solve for getting people the best financial advice out there so they can make good decisions around their money? We don't have good financial education at schools. And I have a saying, if you don't learn it at home, you don't learn it at school, you learn it by making financial mistakes. And that's often costly. I think about that. This is just my own assessment that the average amount of money someone loses in accumulation of wealth is about $150,000 in like missed opportunities, not understanding something like as simple as what a match is, right? What's a 401k match? Or sort of drawing down on their 401k. So really simple things that people should know, don't know, and then don't have anyone to turn to. And so I spent early days in fintech watching all of these great fintech innovations, and what I call verticalizing. So they unbundled the banks. So now you have, robo advisors, neo banks, insurtech, all vertical products. Great. Now we have greater access to those products. We still don't have anyone to turn to say, okay, which product should I use? Why should I use it? How do I use it? I mean, I've had people say, "Oh, I opened up a Robinhood brokerage account. What do I do?" Like literally, like now, what do I do? Right? And these are these fundamentals that um, are easily answerable through sort of AI technology, right? And so what we have done is built something to close the financial advice gap. Call it wealth tech, call it whatever you want, financial literacy to some extent, but it's really more than that because it's walking through a decision making process, right? It's giving you added value, it's encouraging you to take an action, it's surfacing a product so that your whole financial experience really could be in one sort of financial chatbot experience. And I think that's what we're looking to do, is that how do we make it so it's less overwhelming for people, right? Why do you need 10 apps to manage your money? You should really only have one, because guess what? APIs make all of this accessible to bring you back into one experience. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about. At my vision is that much like a Siri, we could be talking to Yoli. That's the name of our financial co-pilot, and you could talk to Yoli and ask her questions about money, but also make transactions and say, hey, Yoli, I have $10,000 sitting in my bank account. What should I do with it? Right. I mean, that's where we're headed. And actually, that's like literally not that far. It could be done
Right.
today with enough money. Um, and so really that's what we're trying to solve for. How we've done that on a technology stack, is a core AI strategy called retrieval augmented generative AI. It's called RAG, for short, and that essentially allows you or a company to talk to your own data. And the reason that this is important, especially in finance, is that you don't want bad answers, right? If you type
Right.
into ChatGPT, you can ask it, how do I get started investing? And it might give you some good summary information, but it's going to make some assumptions. And because it hasn't asked you any questions,
Right.
it only relies on what you're giving it. And then it's searching data. Now, this has been updated, but it's searching old data, because remember that ChatGPT's foundational model is only updated, I think, now to 2021. That means that if you ask it any questions related to a 401k and that law has changed or the interest rates have changed on something, you're not going to get the most up to date information. That's not viable. And you
Right.
don't want bad answers or wrong answers in finance. And so
Well, you don't
RAG
want old data.
or old
Like,
data.
old data, like, I mean, the way the interest rates have changed just in the last 6 months has been dramatic, up and then starting to go down, but it's like, if you're
Right.
looking at 2021, that's not gonna help you make a right financial decision for today.
That's exactly right. I mean, anything from just even an emergency savings. If you ask me, oh, I have $10,000, what should I be doing with it? Search it. What we would have our agent, our co-pilot agent, do is go search current interest rates for high yield savings accounts and CDs and recommend products based on that, right?
Right.
And gonna ask you things like, do you need this money immediately, right? Is this a timeline issue? If you're saying no, I don't need it, I'm going to say, oh, great, there are CDs with a higher interest rate. So it's that kind of walking through a path, but one that has a fence around it. That's how I think about
Right.
the RAP model. It has a fence around it so that when we can go in there, we can update it, we can kind of create the conversations so that they're guided in the way that we think makes sense for our end users. And then in addition, we use a lot of the tooling to add on things like, I mean, things as simple as like calculation. So being able to do your net worth like immediately, right? It's some of these things in finance are not complicated, but of course, financial institutions have a reason to keep you inside of their platforms, right? And so sometimes it's like, oh, talk to our financial advisor. It's like, you don't need to talk to a financial advisor necessarily to just do your net worth. It's a simple math equation. What's your
Right.
assets minus your obligations? So I think
But if
things
you
like that,
but if you don't know, like, those basic terms, like assets and, yeah, I'm,
liabilities
like,
or
blanking.
obligations, yes.
Liability, yeah, then you're like, "Okay, but I don't know what those are," then it's like, "Well, I'll talk to someone." But if
Yeah,
you can have someone helping you that, because it's a simple equation, but it does require going to a lot of different apps and doing a lot of and adding everything together. But yeah.
Right. So that's essentially creating a better workflow for personal finance, right? And a better way to manage your money and to incorporate it so that really can truly be a all-in-one app. I think that's been the promise of fintech, and it hasn't quite delivered. And I think that's what we're solving at the really the high end. And then the way that we're doing it in terms of a product is that we have a sort of a suite of APIs. And so we are a B2B to C, so selling into financial institutions so that they can better serve their core customers, right? And we see a lot of use cases for this, including insurance brokers, neobanks, regional banks, community credit unions, even a financial wellness program for a workforce, an employer. So there's a lot of different use cases. And reason for that is because of RAG, and because we can white label that data source, right? And so that's key. So we can go into an employer and say, okay, here's all the benefits that for this employer. We're going to bring all that information into our knowledge base. We're going to sort of vectorize it and do all the things that make it easy to sort of scan and read, so that when our chatbot interacts with it, it can quickly deliver a quality and secure and trusted answer.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about like my military background, and my husband's been in the military, and so he's close to retirement, and every time I've done like a retirement calculator, it can't understand that like how military retirement works, and so then I kind of like have to say, "Oh, okay, this gives me a general idea, but it's not customizable to what actually is going to happen." And so that's just like one example. And I love being able to like look at what the company offers, and then using like your your personal finance information, what your company offers, and then like merging the two together with like specific advice. We have
Right.
a question in the chat, so I'm going to ask it. Are you building your app through an open AI source? It's from Erica.
Great
I can put it
question.
on the screen.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes and no. We started before ChatGPT. So when we started building, and we had bootstrapped the company, we started with all open source. So Raza at that time was doing open source, and they have a great natural language processing system. And so we started with Raza. The other thing that Raza allowed us to do was to do multi-turn conversations. And I know that sounds simple enough. It just means that I can ask you something, ingest that information, and then answer. ChatGPT doesn't work like that, right? You just give it information and you can ask more, but it doesn't ask you things necessarily. And so that multi-turn was really important. So Raza was doing that. We use Hugging Face, we use Pinecone, and we use LangChain, which we still use. I love LangChain, because that's a tooling, right? It allows us to do a whole bunch of things through API integrations. So we recently got into the IBM FinTech FastPass program. So we are moving on to the IBM platform, which is going to give us really enterprise level capabilities using Watson and Discovery. So we're kind of matching a lot of the open source tools that we use into an enterprise system. And the reason for that is that this year in particular, I think you're going to hear more about trusted AI, and especially in finance. So because we are selling into financial institutions, we have to be very careful about compliance and regulatory environments and security. And so the IBM platform provided that opportunity for us to do that. But you can build an open AI resources and tooling. I mean, like all the tools that I just mentioned, Hugging Face, Raza to some extent still is open source, LangChain, those are all great platforms to build on.
Yeah, and I was going to ask about IBM FinTech, but you did such a great job of talking about it. So let's move on to my next question, which is something that I've heard a lot of talk about in the general like finance of the great wealth transfer.
Mhm.
And what role does, well, I guess we could first say like, what is it? And then what role does WealthBuild hope to play in that?
Absolutely. So the great wealth transfer at $68 trillion is going to transfer to the next generation. As people get older, they start to retire. Part of retirement is that you actually have to draw down money. So think of the Fidelity, Vanguards, all these big wealth managers that manage your pension funds. If you're a teacher, they manage, your 401k accounts. So you pay into your employer, but that employer essentially ships that money off to somewhere else. And those are big wealth managers, right? Fidelity, Vanguard, those are the big ones. And so what's going to happen is people are going to start to draw down that money. And then they're also going to be passing on. And as they pass on and as they draw down that money, they're going to start delivering that to their children. Their children are going to be what I call the older millennial, if you will, and perhaps even the Gen Z, depending on the age gap. And so as that $68 trillion starts to transfer, meaning you've inherited that money, or perhaps someone gave you an in vivo inheritance, which means I can give you money right now. It's about up to $15,000 that you can give to someone tax free every year. A lot of wealthy people do this. It's a kind of a $15,000 check every year to their children because it doesn't have to be taxed essentially. So that wealth transfer is happening. What we're concerned about and what we are saying that WealthBuild will help to do is help people manage that money, right? Because a lot of people that are going to be getting that money have no clue how to use it to make sure that it continues to build wealth for them, right? I think there's a lot of reasons, both macro and micro. From a macro point of view, you've got people just at whose standard of living hasn't increased because your wages have not increased, inflation is high, student loan debt, home prices are higher. The older generation had the opportunity to buy a home, not be in as much debt early on in life, so they had assets they invested in, and those assets have now increased. As those get transferred over, though, a lot of people are like, how am I going to use this? Like, I need to just pay off my debt, versus, okay, this might be the only big a chunk of change that I get. I better figure out how to manage it. And most of those people are not necessarily going to go to a traditional financial advisor. And this is where we come into play, is as we get embedded in your credit union, in your financial app, in your workplace HR benefit solution, you can start to access our knowledge and resources to help you make better choices about that wealth transfer that's coming down. And again, it could be anything from you inherited cash to inheriting a home, or inheriting a 401k or an IRA or life insurance. There's all kinds of different ways that wealth is transferred. And so a lot of questions are going to come up about that, especially around taxes and sort of what do I do and how do I invest it? Because we've made investing very accessible, but to no one's surprise, people still don't know exactly what to do.
Yeah, that is very true. And it's really interesting because that is like if you got a huge chunk of change and you have all this debt, I mean, you might think the smartest thing to do is to pay off all your debts, but if you talk to a financial advisor, they might give you something that's totally different. So if you're able to give people that access of like the information of like,
Mm.
yes, you could put some of it towards paying off your debts, but you also could put some of it so you could buy a house and like not have to keep renting, and how that could change your life so that you could pay your other debts off. So that makes a lot of sense that it's not just like someone gets all this money and then they're like, "Yay, I know what to do." It's like can be like overwhelming. And then yes, they've
Yep.
made it a lot easier to invest with like, these online tools where you can buy stocks much easier than you used to be able to, but then people don't really always know what they're doing, and sometimes they get in trouble and they don't, I've seen stories of people not knowing what the numbers mean on the chart and freaking out. And so that's another scary thing. So, yeah,
Right.
having more information.
I mean, and the other thing that I will say, and this is part of the stack, but I think I'm going to humanize it for a minute. Um, at the end of the day, especially with wealth management, there's many ways to do something. If you're coding, you know this. There's probably 3, 4 ways to do one thing. Some coder will say, no, you got to do it this way. Another somebody will say you got to do it this way. That's the same thing in wealth management. The advice you get from me will be a little bit different than advice you get from someone else. There's some factual things that by law, can you actually do this under tax circumstances or under the IRS? Yes or no, right? But most of it's in this gray area. And I think that's where people get overwhelmed or confused or like, who do I trust? And one of the things that we're working on, because a lot of it, and you'll give us information, we'll give you recommendations. At the end of the day, it's still your choice. But we're looking at 2 things. One is bringing in fractional certified financial planners so people can say, oh, this is a moment when I actually need to talk to someone. And you, by part of a subscription model, might be able to get access to a certified financial planner at a fractional cost. It's like a fractional CFO. So that's one thing. But the other thing that's really key as part of how we are building and training our AI is using a mechanism of reinforcement learning. And this is actually, you'll hear this a lot in the machine learning sort of foundational model space. And that what that does is we are bringing together experts in the field. So take, for example, life insurance, bringing together life insurance experts and testing their opinions against our training model, right? And that's called reinforcement learning, because what you're doing is saying, here's the answer that the AI gave right now. And then you'd have these experts all say, here's the better answer. And between those, you're going to find kind of the right answer for the model. And that allows the model to learn, but also we know that it's been kind of quality checked with real humans still in the mix.
Yeah, I like that. I like hearing the human aspect because then you know that it's not just like an algorithm that's spinning. I mean, it is, but it's been checked by other humans and they agree. And so then it kind of makes it just feel, I guess, more personal.
Yeah, I mean, it's both personal and it's also, that way you get variation, right? You also get like what is really the best answer, the trusted answer. It's if you've got 5, 6 experts on life insurance planning, you're going to find some similarities. And what the AI does is bring that similarity to bear, right? It's like, okay, here's the
Yeah.
algorithm, here's the average. If you ever did regression analysis, it's essentially
Yeah.
finding
Don't remind me. Don't
the
remind me.
finding the sort of the dot in the middle with the least amount of friction, right? So I think that's what we're looking to do with building out this reinforcement learning piece.
Yeah. So if someone is like really interested in learning more about Wealth Build, how can they get access to the tools that you're creating, or how can they stay informed if you're not quite there yet?
Yeah, so yeah, we are still in our beta mode for our B2B. You can play with Yoli right now at yoli.wealthbuild.ai. You just play around with it. And that's, because we are not direct to consumer at this moment, there's still an opportunity we're looking at right now. But B2B, you can always get in touch with us. I'm very active on social and LinkedIn. And we should be ready to be sort of more in the market by Q2. So really excited to be using the Watson sort of machinery, if you will, the IBM machinery. And so that's what we're gearing up for right now. But you can follow me on Instagram, also at Dinero Diva. You can follow WealthBuild on Instagram, and then LinkedIn in terms of any professional opportunities. But if you are a financial institution that's listening to this or you work for one, just reach out. I'm happy to do a demo internally for folks to see what we can build. Again, I think part of what's great is that we're able to white label this, right? There's small customizations that we can do to our tech stack that allows us to move rapidly and building out for different institutions and use cases.
That's really exciting, and it's really cool that you're, like, so close to, launching, and so if someone's listening, I'll make sure to add your LinkedIn profile in the comments so that people can
Okay.
find it easily once the interview's over, and Instagram too, just because those are such great resources, and LinkedIn is such a great tool. So what we are doing this on Sabio's podcast, and you mentioned that you worked with them like in 2016 and you've been connected with them, but like what is the relationship between WealthBuild and Sabio and in the future and now?
Well, look, I love builders. I consider myself really a technologist as kind of a builder, even though I'm a non-technical coder, right? I don't code, but I'm very deep in the stacks and in the building sense of that is like working with the product. And so I really love connecting with curious people. And I think one of the things that Sabio does well is creates a really good community of curious builders, even if you're working for a traditional company. And I think that especially for folks coming out of the sort of boot camp model, getting that hands-on experience is really key. So we've had a couple of folks come work with us and as sort of like an internship to get acquainted with AI. So that's great. We're always looking for people. Um, and I think because it's a new space, it's a really great way to kind of get your hands in it and see what's happening and be part of a startup team. Startups are a lot of work, and I think before you dive into one officially, it's always good to know like what am I getting into. And I think this is a great way that we have continued the relationship with Sabio, which is sort of if there's a project we're working on, looking for freelancers or looking for people that want some work experience. That's something that we often do with Sabio.
That's awesome. And I agree. Sabio has such a great community of, people who are curious, who are learning, who want to help each other. It's just been so cool to be part of the Sabio community and to learn about what they're doing. And I loved learning about like what you can do with, graduating from Sabio and coding. There's so much opportunity, and it just sounds like there's going to be more and more things that come up as, AI changes and grows and they'll just need more and more coders to do the work
I,
because there's just more and more stuff to do, right?
that's exactly right. And I will say this. One of the skills you want to be really good at if you want to get into AI is Python. It's the universal sort of language right now in AI. So learning how to work really well with APIs and being really good at Python. I think those are the skills that are going to pay off in the AI space.
That's good to know. And I know Gregorio is on top of it and working to change and adapt the program for Sabio as new tech comes out. So if you go to Sabio as a student, you're in great hands because he's done 2 interviews with me about AI and all the new things that are happening. And so I think that's another important thing that Sabio is doing is they're staying current and relevant and changing the programs that they offer and the
Mhm.
areas they focus on as the technology changes, it's not static.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have one last piece of advice for anyone who's considering starting their journey in a career in software engineering or in tech? You're not a software engineer, but you're still in tech.
I still am in tech. Um, well, one, it's the future, right? And it's not even the future; it's here. I have a son who's graduating from college this year, and I was like, "Look, here's the 2 jobs that are going to be constant. You could be a software engineer, you could be a data scientist." He chose the data science, and so I that's my essentially my pitch to anyone is that look, everyone's going to be a technology company. There's pretty much nothing that's not touched by technology. And if you're someone that likes to solve problems, this is a great way to do it. not only like externally as an entrepreneur, but also internally, right? If you're working at a bigger company, you're solving a problem for someone in that
Yeah.
company. And I think that's the exciting part, and it's moving so quickly. You can always just learn so much. And I think that's the curious part. So it's really for someone who's interested in expansion and learning, sort of being a lifetime student. I think that's sort of what technology to me is, an innovation.
Yeah, and the strength finders, if you're, like, high in learning it, then I think that's one of my top 5, and I'm like, "This is why this coding, it just sounds so exciting because 'cause you're always learning, it's always changing, there's always more to learn," and so I think that, if you're curious and you wanna learn, it definitely is a great career, but there's so much opportunity out there, so thank you so much for your time, thank you
Of course.
for just sharing your insight and your knowledge, and for the work you're doing for WealthBuild. That's going to help so many people, in so many different industries. So I think it's a really great tool and I'm really excited about it.
Thank you so much, Amanda.